It was a warm June night in 1999 in the quiet town of Perry, Oklahoma. The stars above seemed still, unaware that something evil was stirring on the ground below. Three young men were cruising the streets. Clayton Lockett, 23 years old, with a long criminal record and a short temper, and his two friends, Sean Mathis and Bobby Forrest. They were drifting through life, restless and reckless, until someone in that car suggested something darker than usual, a robbery. And that's where the nightmare began. They decided to target the home of a young man they knew, not because he had anything valuable, but because it was easy. But what they didn't expect was to find more people inside. Stephanie Neiman was 19, just out of high school. She was bold, independent, and brave. She was at the wrong place at the worst time and manageable. When the men burst in, they beat and tied up the occupants. Then, in a moment that would seal his fate, Clayton Lockett dragged one of the women into another room and raped her at gunpoint. The others, including Stephanie, were forced to witness the horror. But Stephanie didn't break. She refused to give up the keys of her pickup. She threatened to call the police. She stood her ground, and that's when Clayton decided she had to die. The group drove her to a remote rural area, still under the cover of darkness. As one of them dug a shallow grave with a shovel, Stephanie was made a kneel. Clayton raised his shotgun and pulled the trigger. The first shot hit her shoulder, the second, her chest. She didn't die immediately. She was still breathing, still conscious. So what did they do? They buried her alive, covered her with dirt, silenced her forever. They left her there, buried in Oklahoma soil, and went on with their night. But justice was already on its way. Lockett was arrested soon after. The evidence was overwhelming. DNA, testimony, confession. In 2000, he was convicted of murder, rape, kidnapping, and burglary. The jury didn't hesitate. The sentence was death. But like many on death row, Clayton Lockett would spend over a decade behind bars, filing appeals, complaining about his conditions, and watching the clock tick down. And when it finally came the time to pay the price, Oklahoma was ready to make an example. April 29th, 2014. Inside the Oklahoma State Penitentiary, everything had been prepared. Clayton Lockett would be the first person executed with a new and highly secretive 3-drug combination. Why secret? Because pharmaceutical companies were pulling out of execution deals. States were scrambling to find alternatives, experimental alternatives. At 6:23 p.m., the IV line was inserted into his groin. After multiple failed attempts in his arms and legs, the drugs began to flow. Midazolam meant to sedate him. Vacuronium bromide meant to paralyze him. Potassium chloride meant to stop his heart. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Instead of falling asleep peacefully, Clayton began writhing. His body jerked violently. He tried to speak, to rise. His eyes popped open. "Something's wrong," he said. The executioners had failed to properly insert the IV. The drugs were not entering his bloodstream. They were leaking into his tissue. For 43 minutes, Clayton Lockett twitched, gasped, groaned, and shook as horrified witnesses watched through the glass. At 6:56 p.m., officials finally called off the execution. But it was too late. Clayton Lockett had died of a massive heart attack at 7:06 p.m. His execution had become exactly what the Constitution prohibits: cruel and unusual punishment. The case shocked the world. Oklahoma paused executions for months. Lawsuits were filed. Human rights groups condemned the process. But Stephanie Neiman's family? They said Clayton Lockett still got far more mercy than Stephanie ever did. And maybe they were right. She never got a last meal. She never got a final appeal. And she never got to say goodbye. Justice, some say, must be swift and fair. But when justice breaks down, it becomes a mirror, reflecting everything a society hides. This was the story of Clayton Lockett, a killer who buried his victim alive in a state that nearly buried its conscience with him. I'm Mr. O'Fluent. Thanks for joining me, and see you next time.